Welcome to Divisionalysis, I'm Fog. TU20 is a week away from when I've made this video, and people are still using these tables to try to predict what is going to be the best weapon in TU20. Now, I've already explained a number of times why this is a useless endeavour. There is a 50% difference between Burst DPS and Sustained DPS in these tables, and we wonder why people are confused. I'm going to try one last time to explain why these numbers are useless for weapon comparison. The first effort that I'm going to make is I'm going to ask a simple question. I'm going to play the same footage over 3 times. All you need to do is answer which is doing sustained damage and which is doing burst damage. I'll see you on the other side. Did you work it out? Of course you bloody didn't. They're exactly the same. We hold down the trigger, automatic fire comes out of the weapon, and the only difference between sustained and burst damage is whether or not you are forced to reload because you run out of bullets, or you choose to reload. That's it. And if you choose to reload before the end of the magazine, as in bursting enemies down, you will do less damage, not more damage, as those charts would tell you. Especially not 50% more damage. This is a simple principle. If you are firing for less time, you are not doing damage for more time. Sustained damage produces more damage than burst damage, not the other way around. Okay, let's take everybody's favourite argument. Oroboros versus St Elmo's. If we put them on a build and we use a burst DPS calculation, or we go into the range and we look at burst DPS, the Oroboros has a DPS of around 17 million, whilst the St Elmo's only has a DPS of 11 million. Now, a burst DPS calculation, or the spreadsheets that you're used to looking at, burst DPS does not care or does not factor in how much time you are not doing damage. And it does not include how much time you are actually doing damage for. 2 of the most important factors when it comes to your damage output. At least a sustained DPS calculation factors both of those things in. It factors in the time for which you can sustain your burst damage, and it also factors in the amount of time that you are not doing damage. And there is very little difference between the St Elmo's and the Oroboros when it comes to their sustained DPS, despite the fact that the Oroboros has a burst DPS of around 55% more, and it also has a faster reload time. The amount of time, or how much magazine capacity, total mag damage your weapon has a significant impact on your ability to output damage. So the classic argument about using burst DPS is, I only use sustained damage for 5% of the time. Okay, well, there's silly as this is, I'm going to indulge it, and I will just show you some footage, and we'll just count the number of reloads, and at the end we'll work out which or how much of the time we're doing sustained damage versus burst damage. So during the same amount of time, the Oroboros did 31 reloads as opposed to the St Elmo's 12 reloads. Now, of those reloads, the St Elmo's did 6 reloads from empty and 6 tack reloads, or reloading the weapon before it was empty. The Oroboros did 20 reloads from empty and only 11 tack reloads, or with rounds left in the magazine. What that means is that the Oroboros was doing sustained damage for 64.5% of the time. The St Elmo's was doing sustained damage 50% of the time. Now, there are differences in the reload speeds between reloading from empty and reloading from not, or attack reload. But what that means is over this same period of time, when you add up all of the reloads, the Oroboros was not doing damage for 42.44 seconds. St Elmo's was only not doing damage for 19.86 seconds. Now, I tried to remove RNG as much as possible, but there was a difference in the number of enemies that each one faced. The St Elmo's actually faced more enemies during this period. 47 enemies for the Oroboros, 49 enemies for the St Elmo's. Now, we can remove all of the guff and work out just the burst damage portion. So just when both of these weapons were firing rounds onto a target. And there were 1,595 rounds fired by the Oroboros at 1,688 RPM. That was 56.7 seconds of doing damage. The St Elmo's, 1,095 rounds fired at 978 RPM, 67.17 seconds doing damage. The Oroboros had a higher burst damage, and it took the St Elmo's longer to clear an equivalent number of enemies. 10.47 seconds longer to clear those enemies. I mean, there were 2 extra enemies, but it took it longer to clear an equivalent number of enemies. The difference is that during that same period of time, the Oroboros was not doing damage for 22.58 seconds more than the St Elmo's. So to clear those enemies, it took the St Elmo's 87.03 seconds in total. It took the Oroboros 99.14 seconds, meaning that the St Elmo's was 13.9% faster overall at clearing those enemies. Now, why did it take the Oroboros so many more rounds? Well, one factor is that it has a lower bullet damage, so it's always going to require more rounds in order to clear those enemies. But the other factor that I see confused a lot is in regards to accuracy. Now, just using an arbitrary figure of 50% accuracy for the Oroboros. Now, even if we were to assume that the St Elmo's had exactly the same accuracy, even though we know that it is a better or a more accurate weapon, even if we assume that it has the same level of accuracy, many people will say that it's 50% accuracy for the St Elmo's. This is incorrect. 50% accuracy for the Oroboros means that of its firing time, it was approximately 1 second off target, or 1 second not doing damage. Now, 1 second not doing damage for the St Elmo's is considerably different to 1 second not doing damage for the Oroboros. In 1 second, the Oroboros will lose 28 rounds to missed damage or to not doing damage, wherein the equivalent amount of time, the St Elmo's will only lose 16 rounds. And that has a significant effect. The higher RPM of the Oroboros means that in 1 second off target, there is a 56% reduction to its effective magazine size. For the St Elmo's, only 22.8% reduction. So in a 50% accurate Oroboros situation, or 1 second off target, it means that the Oroboros is now only doing damage for 38% of its time between reloads, whereas with the St Elmo's, it's doing damage for 67% of the time. And what that means is that the Oroboros would require 76% more damage to achieve equivalency. And what we can see is over the 47 enemies and the 49 enemies for the St Elmo's, we can actually work out what the exact health points of the total of all of those enemies is, divided by the total time doing damage and including the time not doing damage. And what you find is that the Oroboros's achieved DPS is only 1.6 million per second versus the St Elmo's 2.14 million per second. And this is obviously a contrived situation where I've tried to control as good as I possibly can the elements of variance and RNG when it comes to enemy distribution. But what happens when we send both of these weapon systems into a real mission? Right, so out in the real world, the Oroboros did 45 reloads. 6 of those were actually the carbine, but 45 reloads in total. If it hadn't used the carbine, it would have been considerably more. And 25 reloads for the St Elmos. For the Oroboros, 20 of those were from empty and 25 were tac reloads. For the St Elmos, 8 were from empty and 17 were tac reloads. So in a real mission, it was a lower percentage of sustained damage, but still, in the case of the Oroboros, 44.4% sustained damage, and the St Elmos, 33.3%. Reload times don't change, but the total amount of time for not doing damage, 59.8 seconds for the Oroboros, only 39.8 for the St Elmos. Now in this case, it turns out that the Oroboros had to deal with more enemies in this time. 53 for the Oroboros, 51 for the St Elmos. There were 1,507 rounds fired by the Oroboros, 1,077 rounds for the St Elmos. So, doing damage, it only took the Oroboros 53.56 seconds. Whilst doing damage to take down those enemies, it took the St Elmos 66 seconds. So a 12-second advantage to the Oroboros. Once again, the time not doing damage during that period went to the St Elmos, and it was a 20-second difference. Total time for the Oroboros, 113 seconds. For the St Elmos, just shy of 106. A 7.14% advantage on time to the St Elmos. But in the interest of fairness, adding up the total amount of damage required, or the effective health points, in both missions, what we see is that the Oroboros had 14 million more damage to do. And the way that it works out is that there was very little difference, but the St Elmos did take the lead as far as effective damage per second is concerned. In spite of the fact that the Oroboros has 54% more burst DPS, it has a faster reload, and it is also much faster at building strikers' stacks. When we total up both tests, both weapons happened to face exactly 100 enemies. Slight difference in the effective health points, slightly more for the St Elmos. And overall, the effective damage per second of the Oroboros, 1.95 million per second. For the St Elmos, 2.19 million per second. But at the end of the day, this is not about the St Elmos versus the Oroboros. When it comes to the mission, it probably came down to the fact that the Oroboros had to refill from the ammo box twice, as opposed to the St Elmos, which didn't refill at all. As to the difference in the amount of time for the mission that it took. And in regards to the first test at the start of Bank Headquarters, it probably has just as much to do with the fact that we have a health-heavy component, being majority of red enemies, and the 21% health damage that the St Elmos has got gives it an advantage in that respect. Again, not about the St Elmos versus the Oroboros. The point is, if we go all the way back to the start and we compare what Burst DPS told us that these weapons should be doing, the Oroboros 17 million, the St Elmos 11 million, and sustained damage, it was about 8 million for the Oroboros and it was about 7.5 million for the St Elmos. Considerable difference to what we get in the range, or from calculations to what we actually achieve in game. These results are considerably different to what we were told, or what we would expect based on either calculations from a burst DPS and a sustained DPS calculation, or what we achieve in the range. Considerably different. There are a number of factors that affect DPS, but the most important with regards to these calculations. When the number of enemies exceeds the number that you can kill with one magazine, which it always does, a weapon cannot do more damage per second than sustained DPS. That is the maximum that it can do. And when you are burst firing or bursting down enemies, you will do less damage not more. So the only way from a sustained DPS calculation result is down. And then on top of that, you have accuracy, which further impacts your ability to deliver damage in game. And that inaccuracy will affect weapons differently. Continue to use Burst DPS as a comparison tool if you want, but just know that you are ignoring the time that the weapon is not doing damage, and you're also ignoring the amount of time that the weapon can do that Burst DPS for. And as we've seen today, hopefully, I've demonstrated that those two factors are very important in regards to a weapon's performance. So continue to use them, but once again, just know that they are in no way a reflection of a weapon's in-game performance. Now, I oversimplified some of the concepts today, but I needed to do that to make this information more accessible to the vast majority. Because I oversimplified, guaranteed somebody's going to take me out of context and use one sentence that I've said in order to disprove everything. I really don't care anymore. This is information that the community should have had a long time ago. If you appreciate the information, if you understand damage a little bit better now, hit the like button, but I will see you after TU20 drops. Bye bye.